Has your child ever been threatened at school? I was making breakfast when my son Caleb refused to come out of his room for school. I'm done. I'm not going back there. This was the third time this month. Caleb was a straight A student, already accepted early admission to MIT. He was on track to be valedictorian, something he'd worked toward for 4 years. But lately, something had him terrified. Caleb, please tell me what's happening. He slid a piece of paper under his door. Another note, printed on plain paper like the others. Stop now, or everyone will know what you did at Cameron's party. The party had been months ago. Caleb came home early, shaken, but wouldn't say why. Now these notes appeared in his locker, his backpack, even tucked under our windshield wipers, all threatening to expose something from that night. We need to tell someone, I said. No, that'll make it worse. Just let me stay home until graduation. But MIT required final transcripts. Missing more school would tank his GPA and his class rank. Amelia Ellison was right behind him academically, ready to take the valedictorian spot if he slipped. Her mother made sure everyone knew it too, always mentioning how close the race was. I drove to school and demanded to see Principal Ellison, aka Amelia's father. He'd assured us repeatedly that he stayed neutral in academic matters, that his daughter's success was her own merit. He listened with concern as I showed him the threatening notes. This is serious. We'll investigate immediately, he promised. Has Caleb considered taking a mental health leave? Sometimes the pressure of senior year. He's not having a breakdown. He's being threatened. Principal Ellison assigned the vice principal to investigate. Days passed with no progress. More notes appeared, now with blurry photos from the party attached. Nothing clearly incriminating, but enough to terrify Caleb. He started having panic attacks, couldn't sleep, wouldn't eat. I hired a private investigator. What he found made me sick. The paper was from the school's main office printer. The threats were sent during school hours from IP addresses inside the building. Someone with administrative access was terrorizing my son. Mom, please, let me just quit, Caleb begged after another sleepless night. Amelia can be valedictorian. I don't care anymore. But I cared. This wasn't about a title anymore. Someone was systematically destroying my child to clear the path for their own. I installed cameras, documented everything, prepared to go to the school board. Then Caleb's Stanford-accepted friend Ashton came forward. He'd gotten similar threats about a different incident. So had Amy, headed to Yale. Every top student except Amelia had received anonymous threats designed to make them miss school, drop activities, or transfer. We gathered evidence and prepared a presentation for the school board meeting. The night before, our house was broken into. Nothing stolen except my laptop with all the evidence. But I'd backed everything up to the cloud, something our burglar didn't consider. At the board meeting, I presented everything. The IP addresses, the paper trail, the pattern of threats targeting only students competing with Amelia Ellison. Board members looked uncomfortable as the evidence pointed increasingly toward administrative involvement. Principal Ellison stood to respond. These are serious accusations against my family. I assure you. Actually, interrupted Mrs. Zavala from the IT department, I've been tracking the threat's digital footprint. They all originated from one computer. She pulled up logs on the projector. The principal's office computer. The whole room went crazy with people talking and whispering all at once. Principal Ellison's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds, and he dropped back into his chair like someone had pushed him. His mouth kept opening and closing, but no words came out. The board members started looking at each other, and then at the screen where Mrs. Zavala's evidence was still showing. Melvin Pierce stood up and banged his hand on the table 3 times. Order! We need order right now. Everyone slowly got quiet. He looked around the room with this serious expression. This meeting is going into executive session immediately. All parents and students need to leave the room while the board discusses this matter. People started getting up and moving toward the door, but nobody wanted to leave. Security guards showed up and started herding everyone out. I grabbed Caleb's arm and we walked out into the hallway with everyone else. The second we got out there, about 10 parents came up to us. Some looked sorry for us and others just looked curious about what was happening. One mom touched my shoulder and said she always thought something was weird about how only certain kids got targeted. Another parent asked if we were going to sue the school. Caleb stayed right next to me and I could feel his whole body shaking a little bit. His hands were cold when I grabbed one. We pushed through the crowd and headed for the parking lot. I needed to get him out of there and away from all those people staring at us. Mrs. Zavala caught up with us by our car. She looked scared but also kind of proud of what she'd done. I made copies of everything, she said quietly while looking around to make sure nobody was listening. 3 copies, actually. 1 at home, 1 in a safety deposit box, and 1 with my sister in another state. She told us she'd been tracking this stuff for weeks but was too scared to say anything until tonight. Her hands were shaking when she handed me a flash drive. This has everything on it too. The login records, the IP addresses, timestamps, all of it. I thanked her and she hurried to her own car. The drive home felt longer than usual. Caleb didn't say anything the whole way. When we got inside, he went straight to his room. I made some tea and sat at the kitchen table trying to process everything. About an hour later, I heard him walking around upstairs. I went to check on him and found him sitting on his bed with his phone in his hand. He kept refreshing his messages over and over. What if Amelia's friends come after me now? I sat next to him and tried to calm him down, but he couldn't stop checking his phone. Every few minutes, he'd refresh his social media to see if anyone was posting about what happened. Around midnight, he finally fell asleep but kept waking up every hour or so. I stayed in the chair in his room just in case he needed me. Neither of us got much sleep that night. My phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. It was Melvin Pierce. I wanted to inform you that Principal Ellison has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. He explained that the district was bringing in outside auditors to look at everything. We're taking this very seriously and want to assure you that your son's safety is our top priority. After I hung up, my phone started going crazy with notifications. The whole town was talking about it on social media. Some parents were posting that we were making a big deal out of nothing and destroying a good man's reputation. Others were saying they'd suspected something was wrong for months. The local Facebook group had over 300 comments arguing about it. One parent wrote that academic competition had gotten out of control. Another said we were just mad because Caleb couldn't handle the pressure. I had to stop reading because it was making me too angry. Caleb's phone buzzed with a text from Ashton. Amelia's not here today. Everyone's talking about what happened. A few minutes later, Amy texted him too. Teachers won't say anything, but you can tell they're freaked out. Mrs. Johnson looked like she'd been crying. Caleb showed me the messages, and I could see he felt bad about the whole situation, even though none of it was his fault. I decided we needed legal help to understand what might happen next. I found Aurelia Mathis online, an education attorney who specialized in student rights cases. Her office could see us that afternoon. She spent 2 hours going through everything with us. What they did violates FERPA and probably several other laws, she explained. She warned us that the Ellisons might try to retaliate somehow, and we should document everything. Save every text, every email, every social media post, and if anyone threatens or harasses you, call the police immediately. She gave us her cell phone number and told us to call anytime. 3 days went by with the school in chaos. Parents kept calling and texting me wanting to know more details. Then the district announced they'd hired an interim principal to take over. She showed up on Thursday morning and immediately sent out an email to all parents. She was offering accommodations for any students who felt unsafe or uncomfortable. Remote learning was available starting immediately. Special counseling sessions were being arranged. She wanted to meet with each affected family individually. When we met with her, she seemed genuinely concerned about helping the kids get through this mess. She promised Caleb could finish the year remotely if he wanted, and they'd make sure his grades weren't affected by missing class. Your safety and well-being come first, she told him. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept checking the security cameras on my phone every few minutes. Around 2 in the morning, the motion sensor went off, and I saw someone in dark clothes taking pictures of our house with a long camera lens. I woke my husband and called 911 while watching this person move around our front yard getting different angles. The cops showed up in about 10 minutes, but whoever it was had already taken off through the neighbor's backyard. The officers looked at our security footage, but the person wore a hood and kept their face turned away from the cameras. They said they'd add extra patrols to our street, but without a clear face shot, there wasn't much else they could do. The next morning, Aurelia came over with a stack of forms for the state education department. She'd written up everything that happened to Caleb and needed us to sign sworn statements about the threats and harassment. She also had papers from Ashton's family and Amy's parents with their own stories about what their kids went through. The forms asked for specific dates and times and copies of all the threatening notes we'd kept. Aurelia said the state took these complaints seriously and would send their own investigators to look at what the district was doing. While she was organizing the paperwork, my phone rang, and it was the private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. He'd been digging into school access records and found something weird about Mrs. Ellison's keycard use. She'd been in the building after hours at least 15 times in the past 3 months and always signed in for PTA work. But the PTA president told him they only had 2 evening events during that whole time period. He was sending me copies of the entry logs that showed her going into the main office area late at night when nobody else was around. Caleb had been listening from the stairs, and after Aurelia left, he asked if we could find him someone to talk to about all this. I'd already researched therapists who worked with kids dealing with school problems, and found Griffin Broderick, who had great reviews. His office could see us that same afternoon for an intake appointment. Caleb was nervous in the waiting room and kept bouncing his leg up and down. Griffin turned out to be this calm guy in his 40s who didn't push too hard in the first session. He mostly let Caleb talk about how he felt when the threats started showing up, and how scared he was that everyone would find out about the party. Caleb didn't go into details about what happened that night, but Griffin said they'd work up to that when he felt ready. 2 days later, I ran into Mrs. Zavala at the grocery store, and she looked tired and stressed. She pulled me aside near the frozen foods and said some of the other staff members were giving her the cold shoulder. They thought she'd betrayed the school by speaking up at the board meeting. A few teachers wouldn't even talk to her in the break room anymore. I told her she did the right thing, and that we were grateful she had the courage to tell the truth. She said she knew that, but it still hurt to have people she'd worked with for years suddenly treating her like an enemy. That weekend, Melvin Pierce sent out an email blast announcing a community forum for the following Thursday night. He wanted to address parent concerns and explain what the district was doing to fix the problems at the school. The email said they'd booked the main auditorium, which holds about 800 people, and they were expecting a big turnout. Parents were already arguing about it on the town Facebook page, with some saying the district was trying to sweep everything under the rug. Monday morning was Caleb's first try at remote learning from home instead of going to the school. The interim principal had set everything up so he could join his classes through video calls. His chemistry class was first period, but right when the teacher started explaining the lab assignment, the connection kept cutting out. Caleb could only hear every third word, and then the screen froze completely. He was getting frustrated, and I called the school to report the problem. Within 20 minutes, the interim principal herself called back and had their IT person remote into our computer to fix the settings. She stayed on the phone until Caleb was connected properly and could see and hear everything in class. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang from a blocked number, and when I answered, a muffled voice said I should look at the PTA financial records from last year. The person sounded like they were talking through a cloth or something to disguise their voice, but something about the way they said certain words seemed familiar. Before I could ask who it was or why I should check those records, they hung up. I tried calling back, but it just said the number was unavailable. Aurelia came by that evening to go over more evidence, and while she was reading through the threatening notes, she noticed something interesting. The way certain phrases were written matched exactly with templates from the PTA newsletter that Mrs. Ellison had helped write. She showed me how the sentence structure and even some specific word choices were identical to fundraising letters the PTA had sent out. Aurelia made copies of everything and added it to our growing file of evidence against the family. Thursday was Caleb's second appointment with Griffin, and this time they worked on specific techniques for handling panic attacks. Griffin taught him a breathing exercise where he'd count to 4 while breathing in, then hold it for 4, then breathe out for 4. They also talked about how hard it was to trust adults at the school when the people who were supposed to protect him had been the ones hurting him. Saturday afternoon, I was picking up milk and bread at the grocery store when the school custodian walked up to my cart looking nervous and kept glancing around like someone might be watching. He leaned in close and said he needed to tell me something about the keys to the school and how someone had asked him for them several times for what they said was PTA decorating. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a small notebook where he'd written down dates and times going back 3 months. He showed me entries where Mrs. Ellison had asked him for the master key to the main office area, saying she needed to set up for fundraising events, but the dates didn't match any actual PTA activities. I took pictures of his notebook pages with my phone while he kept looking over his shoulder, and then he hurried away saying he'd already talked to the police but wanted me to know too. Monday morning, Melvin called to tell me the district IT department was starting a complete audit of all computer access logs from the past 6 months. The tech team had already found weird patterns in the system where someone with admin privileges had been accessing student records and grade databases at odd hours. They discovered that whoever was doing this had tried to delete their tracks, but the backup servers still had everything recorded. The IT director was compiling a report that would show exactly which accounts were used and when they accessed the threat victim's personal information. Tuesday's mail brought a thick envelope from MIT addressed to Caleb, and when he opened it, his hands were steady for the first time in weeks. The admissions office had written to say they were aware of his situation through news reports and wanted to assure him his acceptance was secure no matter what happened with his current grades. They included information about their student support services and mental health resources, and even offered to connect him with a current student who dealt with similar harassment in high school. Caleb read the letter 3 times and actually smiled when he saw they'd also sent a care package with MIT sweatshirts and stickers. That same afternoon, Amy's mother called asking if she could come over with Amy's father to discuss something important. They arrived with a folder full of printed emails and screenshots showing the threats Amy had gotten over the past 4 months. Her dad had created a timeline that matched up perfectly with major test dates, and showed how each threat arrived right before crucial exams that affected class rankings. They'd also documented 7 other students who'd received similar threats and wanted to work together to present everything to the authorities. We spent 2 hours comparing notes and creating a master document that showed the clear pattern of academic sabotage targeting anyone who might compete with Amelia for top honors. Wednesday brought news that the interim principal was making big changes to the school security procedures. She sent out an email explaining that from now on, any after-hours access to the building would require 2 staff members to be present and sign in together. Teachers complained in the parking lot about the inconvenience, but most of them understood why it was necessary after everything that had happened. The new system also included security cameras in all administrative areas and automatic alerts if anyone accessed student records outside normal hours. Thursday morning, a reporter from the local paper called wanting to do an interview about the scandal and how it was affecting our family. I immediately called Aurelia, who listened to what the reporter was asking for, and advised that we should be very careful about what we said publicly while the investigation was ongoing. We decided to write out a statement instead of doing a live interview, so we could control exactly what information got released. Aurelia helped me draft something that focused on the facts without making accusations we couldn't prove yet. Friday afternoon brought shocking news when multiple parents texted me that Mrs. Ellison had been seen going into the district office with a man in a suit who looked like a lawyer. Word spread quickly through the parent network that she'd been called in to give testimony about her access to the school, and specifically about the times she'd borrowed keys from the custodian. People who worked at the district office said she was in there for over 3 hours and came out looking pale and upset. The following Monday was Caleb's 4th session with Griffin, and something major happened during their time together. When Caleb came out of the office, his eyes were red from crying, but he looked relieved, like a huge weight had lifted off his shoulders. In the car, he told me he'd finally been able to talk about what really happened at Cameron's party all those months ago. He'd seen someone slip something into a girl's drink, and when he tried to intervene, the person threatened him and said they had connections that could ruin his future if he told anyone. The threats that started showing up later were designed to keep him quiet about what he'd witnessed that night. Griffin had helped him understand that staying silent was protecting someone dangerous, and that speaking up was the right thing to do, even if it was scary. Tuesday morning, 2 police detectives showed up at our door saying they were reopening the investigation into our break-in from before the board meeting. They'd gotten new information suggesting it was connected to the school scandal, and wanted to collect evidence they'd missed the first time. They spent hours dusting for fingerprints on door handles and window frames, and took samples from places the burglar might have touched. One detective mentioned they were also looking into whether the break-in constituted witness tampering since it happened right before we were supposed to present evidence. Wednesday evening, Ashton called Caleb with an interesting discovery he'd made while going through his own threatening notes. He'd created a spreadsheet showing exactly when each threat arrived, and realized they weren't random at all, but perfectly timed to cause maximum damage. Every single threat came right before major tests or assignments that counted heavily toward final grades and class rankings. The pattern was so precise it couldn't be coincidence, and showed whoever was behind this understood exactly how the academic ranking system worked, and when students would be most vulnerable to pressure. The community forum was scheduled for Thursday night at 7, and the auditorium was already packed when we arrived at 6:30. Melvin Pierce stood at the front with a thick folder and a laptop connected to the projector, while angry parents filled every seat and lined the walls. He cleared his throat and pulled up a slide showing timeline charts and security logs from the past 6 months. The external audit team had found over 40 separate security failures, including unlocked doors after hours and disabled cameras during key times when threats were sent. Parents started shouting questions about how this could happen for so long without anyone noticing or stopping it. A dad from the back yelled that his daughter had been too scared to apply for scholarships because of the threats she'd gotten. Melvin held up his hand for quiet and said the investigation was ongoing, but they'd already found clear evidence of someone using admin access to bypass normal security protocols. Mrs. Zavala walked to the microphone next, and my heart swelled with pride at her bravery as she faced the packed room. She pulled up computer logs on the screen showing exactly how someone had logged into the system using principal credentials and sent threats while making them look anonymous. Her hands shook slightly as she explained how the person knew exactly which security features to disable and when teachers would be out of their rooms. She showed timestamps proving the threats were sent during school hours from computers that required keycard access to reach. The crowd got louder with each piece of evidence she presented, and several parents stood up demanding to know who was responsible. Mrs. Zavala said she couldn't name names yet, but the digital trail was clear and undeniable. After she finished, the administrative assistant stood up from her seat in the middle row and asked to speak. Her voice cracked as she admitted she'd given Mrs. Ellison keys to the building at least 6 times over the past 3 months. She said Mrs. Ellison always claimed it was for PTA decorating or setting up for events, and she never thought to question it. The assistant started crying and said she felt terrible for not realizing something was wrong when Mrs. Ellison asked her not to log the visits. Parents around her looked shocked, and several people took out their phones to record her confession. The next morning, Caleb told me Amelia had come back to the school after being absent for a week. He said she looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and kept to herself instead of sitting with her usual group at lunch. She'd approached him between classes and asked if they could talk privately, but he wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He felt bad for her because it wasn't her fault what her mom did, but he still couldn't separate her from all the pain he'd been through. That afternoon, the local newspaper published their investigation on the front page with a huge headline about academic sabotage at our school. The reporter had interviewed 12 students who'd received threats and created a chart showing how only students competing with Amelia were targeted. They'd also gotten copies of grade reports showing how each threatened student's attendance and grades dropped after getting the notes. The article included quotes from college admissions officers saying this kind of systematic harassment could affect scholarship opportunities for years. Public opinion started shifting hard against the Ellisons, with people posting angry comments online and calling for criminal charges. 2 days later, we got a call from MIT admissions saying they understood our situation and would grant Caleb a deferral if he needed it. They assured us his acceptance was secure along with his financial aid package regardless of when he decided to start. This took huge pressure off because Caleb had been panicking about maintaining his grades while dealing with panic attacks and therapy. The admissions officer said they'd been following the news and wanted to support students facing this kind of harassment. Griffin called that evening to update me on Caleb's progress in therapy over the past few weeks. He said Caleb was developing healthy coping strategies and learning to separate his identity from just being the smart kid. They'd been working on breathing exercises and grounding techniques for when anxiety hit him at the school. Griffin mentioned that Caleb was starting to understand his worth came from more than grades and test scores. The district sent out an email Wednesday announcing that all affected students could take their finals through proctored remote testing. This meant kids could take exams from home with a webcam monitor instead of sitting in the same building where they'd been terrorized. The accommodation would help level things after months of disruption to their studies and mental health. Several parents texted me saying this was a huge relief for their kids who were still scared to be at the school. Thursday afternoon, 2 detectives showed up at our door with news about our break-in from weeks earlier. They'd matched fingerprints from our door handles and window frames to someone who had legitimate access to the school building. They couldn't name the suspect yet, but said they were building a strong case for criminal charges, including breaking and entering plus witness tampering. The detective said the fingerprint match was solid evidence that would hold up in court. After they left, 3 different parents knocked on my door over the next 2 hours to apologize for doubting our claims initially. They each shared stories about the pressure their own kids faced in the honors program and how they'd noticed concerning patterns, but stayed quiet. One mom said she'd always thought something was off about how Amelia's grades suddenly improved junior year, but didn't want to cause drama. They all offered to support us however we needed, and said they felt terrible for not speaking up sooner. Aurelia called me that same evening with papers ready for me to sign, and said she was filing cease and desist orders against anyone who'd been harassing the victim students. She explained that civil lawsuits would follow if anyone tried more intimidation, and she'd already sent formal notices to several families who'd been posting nasty things online about us. The paperwork was thick, and covered every possible angle of protection for Caleb and the other kids who'd been targeted. I signed everything while Caleb sat next to me looking relieved that someone was finally taking legal action to protect him. The next morning, the school board held an emergency meeting, and I watched the live stream from home since Caleb didn't want to go in person. They voted unanimously to revise their conflict of interest policies, so no administrator could oversee academic competitions involving their own children going forward. Board members looked uncomfortable as they discussed how this situation had exposed major flaws in their oversight systems. Melvin stood up and apologized directly to the camera, saying the district had failed to protect its most vulnerable students. The policy changes would take effect immediately and apply retroactively to this year's academic awards. That weekend, Caleb asked if Ashton and Amy could come over to study together, since they were all struggling with the same issues. They started meeting at our house every Sunday afternoon to help each other with missed work and share strategies for managing their stress. I'd make snacks and leave them alone in the dining room where they'd spread out their books and laptops across the table. Sometimes I'd hear them laughing, which was such a relief after months of seeing Caleb so anxious and withdrawn. The support group became their safe space where they could talk about what happened without judgment. Monday brought shocking news when the interim principal sent out an email announcing that due to the extraordinary circumstances, the school would name co-valedictorians this year. Both Caleb and Amelia would share the honor, which meant neither family could claim total victory in this mess. Some parents complained that this was unfair to Amelia, but most understood it was the only reasonable solution given everything that had happened. Caleb didn't care about sharing the title since he just wanted to graduate and move on with his life. The announcement helped ease some tension at the school, though kids still whispered when either Caleb or Amelia walked by. 3 days later, the police called to tell me Mrs. Ellison had been formally charged with criminal harassment and breaking and entering. Her arraignment was set for the following week, and the charges carried potential jail time if she was convicted. The news spread through the PTA community like wildfire, with parents taking sides and arguing on social media about whether criminal charges were too harsh. I blocked most of them and focused on helping Caleb prepare for his finals, which were coming up fast. The detectives said they had solid evidence, including the fingerprints from our house, and witness testimony from the school staff who'd given her access. During his therapy session that week, Caleb told Griffin he wanted to attend graduation in person, instead of watching online like we'd discussed. Griffin worked with him on breathing exercises and visualization techniques to prepare mentally for being in a crowd again. They practiced what Caleb would do if he felt panic rising, and created a plan for where I'd be sitting, so he could see me from the stage. Griffin said this was huge progress and showed Caleb was reclaiming his power over the situation. The district released their final audit report 2 days before Mrs. Ellison's arraignment, and it was damning for Principal Ellison. While they couldn't prove he directly wrote the threats, the report showed he'd failed completely in his oversight duties and ignored multiple red flags. The board voted to permanently remove him from his position and ban him from any district employment in the future. His teaching license was also under review by the state, which meant his career in education was basically over. Some teachers who'd worked with him for years said they couldn't believe he'd let this happen under his watch. The judge granted a restraining order against Mrs. Ellison the day after her arraignment, requiring her to stay at least 500 feet away from all victim families. She was also banned from the school property, while her criminal case was pending, which meant she couldn't attend her own daughter's graduation. Her lawyer argued this was excessive, but the judge said the safety of the victims was the priority. The order would stay in place until the criminal trial was resolved, which could take months. With 2 weeks left before graduation, Caleb sat down to take his remote finals from our kitchen table with a proctor watching through the laptop camera. He'd studied hard with Ashton and Amy, and felt prepared despite missing so many classes during the worst of the harassment. Each exam took 3 hours, and he had to keep his hands visible the whole time while the proctor verified his identity every 30 minutes. His grades came back strong enough to maintain his academic standing and secure his spot at MIT. We celebrated with pizza and ice cream that night, just the two of us. Saturday afternoon, I was picking up milk at the grocery store when I saw Amelia standing by the cereal aisle looking lost. She walked over with tears in her eyes and said she had no idea what her mother had been doing to other students. Her voice shook as she apologized for her family and said she'd never wanted to win valedictorian this way. I told her this wasn't her fault, even though the pain was still raw, and it was hard to separate her from everything we'd been through. She walked away quickly, and I stood there holding my milk, while other shoppers pretended not to notice the awkward moment. The next week brought news that the district was rolling out mandatory ethics training for every administrator and PTA officer in response to our case. They created an anonymous tip line where students could report academic harassment without fear of retaliation, something that should have existed years ago. The training sessions would happen monthly, and attendance was required to maintain any position of authority in the school system. Melvin called to tell me they were using our case as the primary example of what not to do, though they kept names redacted for legal reasons. 2 weeks before graduation, Caleb sat at the kitchen table staring at the email asking if he wanted to give the valedictorian speech. His hands shook slightly as he typed his response declining the opportunity, saying it would be too stressful after everything. The school asked Amelia to give the speech instead, and she apparently spent days writing something neutral about overcoming challenges, without mentioning any specifics about what had happened. Graduation day arrived hot and humid with the ceremony scheduled for the football field. Our section filled up early with Mrs. Zavala saving seats, Aurelia arriving with her whole family, and Griffin coming straight from another appointment still wearing his work badge. Caleb waited in the staging area with the other graduates while I watched him through binoculars from the bleachers, making sure he was okay. The principal called names alphabetically, and when they got to Caleb's name, the applause was genuine from most of the crowd, though I noticed some families sitting on their hands. He walked across the stage with his head up and shook hands with the interim principal, who gave him an extra pat on the shoulder. The whole ceremony took 2 hours in the blazing sun, with obvious tension visible in how families had separated themselves into different sections of the bleachers. Some parents still supported the Ellisons and sat near where they would have been if allowed to attend, while others who supported us clustered together on the opposite side. Nobody said anything out loud, but you could feel the divide in the air like static before a storm. After the caps flew and families rushed the field for pictures, I noticed how some kids avoided each other completely while their parents stood in tight defensive circles. 3 days after graduation, an email from MIT confirmed they were moving Caleb's enrollment to spring semester instead of fall, giving him time to recover and work at a tech startup downtown. The internship paid well and would give him real-world experience before starting college. Plus, the company was excited to have someone with his coding skills even without a degree yet. Mrs. Ellison's court date came 6 weeks after graduation, with reporters camping outside the courthouse. She ended up pleading guilty to reduced charges of misdemeanor harassment and criminal trespass, getting 2 years probation and 300 hours of community service. The judge also ordered her to attend counseling specifically focused on competitive parenting and the damage caused by academic pressure on children. Her lawyer tried to argue for a lighter sentence, but the judge said the systematic nature of the harassment required serious consequences. The school district's lawyers contacted us about settling the civil claims 2 months after graduation. They offered to cover all of Caleb's therapy costs, plus additional funds for academic support, and a public acknowledgement of the harm done to multiple students. We accepted because it wasn't about money, but about them admitting officially that they'd failed to protect kids in their care. The settlement also covered Ashton and Amy's families, along with 4 other students who came forward after the story went public. Mrs. Zavala called me personally to share that she'd been promoted to District YT Security Director, with a substantial raise and expanded responsibilities. She was already implementing new monitoring systems to flag suspicious activity and prevent anyone from using school resources to harass students again. The promotion ceremony happened quietly, but I heard from teachers that everyone knew she'd earned it by standing up when it mattered most. Caleb started his internship in early July, taking the bus downtown every morning with his laptop bag, and looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. He came home the first week talking nonstop about the projects he was working on, and the friends he was making who didn't know anything about the valedictorian mess. The office had a game room and free snacks, and nobody cared about high school grades or who got what award. His supervisor told me during a company picnic that Caleb was one of their best interns, and they were already talking about offering him part-time remote work during college. By late summer, we'd settled into a new routine with Caleb working 40 hours a week and spending evenings teaching himself new programming languages. 3 months after graduation, Griffin called to say Caleb had made so much progress that they were reducing sessions to monthly check-ins instead of weekly appointments. He said Caleb had shown remarkable resilience in processing the trauma and was developing healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with stress and anxiety. The panic attacks had stopped completely, and he was sleeping through the night without medication for the first time since the threats started. The letter from Ashton arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was sorting through bills. He'd written 3 pages by hand about how our fight had changed him at Stanford, where he'd just started a group called Students Against Academic Harassment that already had 40 members signed up. Amy's thank you card came the same week with a Yale postmark, telling me she'd almost dropped out before we spoke up, but now she was getting straight A's and running for student government. I ran into the grocery store manager who mentioned Principal Ellison had moved to Colorado for some corporate training job since no school district would hire him after everything came out. The cashier added that Amelia was taking classes at the community college and working at the bookstore downtown, trying to figure out who she was without her parents pushing her. Our house felt different now with the new alarm system and cameras we'd installed, but in a good way since Caleb could finally relax knowing nobody was watching or leaving notes. He'd started cooking dinner twice a week and actually invited friends over to play video games, something he hadn't done since junior year. The State Education Board contacted me about testifying for their new conflict of interest policies they were drafting because of our case. They wanted specific examples of how administrators could abuse their positions, and I spent 3 hours in their conference room walking them through everything that had happened. The new rules they passed required any administrator with a child in the same school to recuse themselves from all academic ranking decisions. Education leadership programs started using our case as a required study module about ethics and the dangers of competitive academic pressure. Caleb came home from his last therapy session with Griffin saying he felt ready to start MIT in the spring semester. He'd learned his worth wasn't just about being valedictorian, but about standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. The internship had shown him he was good at coding and problem-solving regardless of high school rankings. His boss offered to let him work remotely part-time during college, which would help with expenses and give him real experience. I started attending every school board meeting as a community member, sitting in the front row with my notebook. The new superintendent made sure parents had input on all policy changes, especially anything involving student safety and harassment prevention. Other parents started joining me, forming an unofficial watchdog group to make sure what happened to our kids never happened again. The district hired 2 new counselors specifically trained in academic pressure and competitive stress, after our group pushed for mental health resources. And 6 months after that morning when Caleb wouldn't leave his room, I dropped him off at MIT for orientation week. He hugged me in front of the dorm without caring who saw, then grabbed his bags and walked toward his new life with actual excitement on his face. His roommate was from California and had never heard of our whole mess, which was exactly what Caleb wanted. I drove home alone but not sad, knowing we'd fought a system and won, not just for us but for every kid who came after. The house felt empty that first week without him, but then he called to tell me about his professors and the robotics club he'd joined. His voice sounded light and happy in a way it hadn't since sophomore year, before all the pressure started. Mrs. Zavala sent me a message that the new monitoring systems she'd implemented had already caught 2 attempted harassment cases that got shut down immediately. She said our willingness to fight had given her the backing she needed to make real changes in how the district protected students. Even the teachers seemed different at the school events, more willing to speak up when they saw something wrong instead of staying quiet to protect their jobs. Our story had become required reading in 3 different states' education programs, as an example of what happens when academic competition goes too far. Caleb texted me pictures from his first hackathon at MIT, where his team won third place and nobody cared that he'd been co-valedictorian instead of sole valedictorian. The whole experience had been horrible while we lived through it, but seeing him thriving now made every sleepless night worth it. Justice had actually been served, not just in the legal consequences, but in the real changes that protected future students from going through what our kids had endured. That's today's breakdown. I always try to leave you with something useful, not just a story. Hopefully you found a little takeaway in there. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.